Okay, hello everyone. We are continuing our discussion of Tabular and its design for the upcoming version of Wolfram language. All right, so changes since the last meeting. Aggregate rows, key columns marked in gray. Okay, there are only type icons for strings and expressions. Okay, so where do we start?
Right. So the other day we were looking at these three functions and we were suggesting
Yeah,
names.
maybe we should start with comparing pivot wider and pivot taller since we with
Wait,
those
wait, wait,
that
wait, wait a
short
minute.
shift.
Those ones. Okay, aggregate rows is the new reduced tabular, right?
Yes.
Okay, key columns are marked in gray. Do I see that here?
Not in this example, but if you go down a little bit, you see that. So
This
pivot
is
table.
clearly not the right graphic design, right? We know
Yes,
that, right?
yes.
Okay.
It's what was
And
whipped together in 72 hours, in less than
okay,
72 hours.
Yeah.
okay, that's fine.
Steven, I was really listening to the end of the meeting that I missed about this thing, but I was thinking, like, if instead of having these icons, we'd had something that distinguished strings also in terms of like of the data itself. Like if
Well, we
strings were
do that,
also
right?
in
I
black.
mean, in the standard in the product, right? If I
Yeah.
type in a string, that's slightly, that's slightly gray. I don't
Yeah.
know if that may be sufficient. On the
And I
other
was
hand, I
thinking
think it's
maybe,
also ugly to have, I would prefer to have a hint up here than to make this all gray. I don't think we have anybody from graphic design here, so I'm not sure that we should have that discussion
yeah,
right now.
and I was thinking that also things like dates could be distinguished. Like in date object, it's blue, it's not black. So we kind of
Okay,
already do
let's
that
do some
here.
experiments, but that's a graphic design issue. Let's get graphic design to do those experiments, okay? I'm a little bit concerned about having something where I don't know whether this hint is going to be enough. I don't know, and I don't want it to be the case that, we want tabular to be an output format, not something that has, you know, is themed for typing particularly. Do you see what I'm saying? We don't want to spray sort of, oh, let's tell you about the data type all over the thing. Get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. So we got two choices. Let's get mock-ups of them. Okay. The two choices are we make some small change to the appearance of the whole thing. The other possibility is we get an indication up there. And let's see, who's Carla is project managing here. So Carla, can you make sure that those things happen and that we get those mock-ups in the next meeting? We have appropriate people from design here to
Yeah,
talk about them.
I am
Okay.
on.
All right.
Yeah,
Let's
I'm
let's
present.
let's go on,
But
please.
Steven, sorry, you were talking simultaneously about key columns and strings. So which one are you talking about?
I'm just talking about the strings issue, the
The
data
strings.
types
Okay.
issue. Okay,
Okay.
let's see the key columns example. Where is that?
Well, no, no,
That's
no.
right there, right?
Exactly.
Those are
What
key
I'm saying is
columns.
that in the previous meeting, we had to manually change some of those colors to gray. So now you see that pivot table is already returning something marked with a key column class in your first example there.
Where? This one here? Oh, I see.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So pivot table returns the
Oh, I see.
file.
That's perfectly nice.
Yeah. I think that helps understanding. And it also shows the role of
No, wait a
the
second.
two
The
different.
1, 2, 3, 4s are gone here.
Exactly.
Is that what we intend? Do you understand my question?
Yes.
Yeah, the 1, 2, 3, 4, I presume, is because that's nameless, right?
I think they should be gone, yeah, because the
They should be
way
gone
that
in
you
this
read,
case, in the key column case, but not in this case.
right? Yeah,
Okay, so if there is no key column, you get the 1, 2, 3, 4s. If there is a key column, which are in gray and on a gray background, if you do have a key column, the key columns are indicated in gray, and there is no 1, 2, 3, 4. Agreed?
Uh, I think there should be an option to toggle that just graphical option because sometimes
Okay.
you might.
Can we? Who's setting up those graphical options? Who's setting those up? Who has an inventory of those?
I don't know.
Well,
Okay,
I'm not
Carla,
sure
can
what
you
you
make
mean
sure
by
we have an
graphical
inventory of those,
option.
please?
Yeah, I'll do
Yeah,
that.
I'm thinking that there are some.
I don't know what is meant by a graphical option.
No,
Well,
what
I
I'm
mean,
saying
there's
is
some
that
appearance option, yes or
yeah,
no? Is there an appearance option for Tabular?
Yes.
There are a number of them, like for
No,
coloring.
no.
Okay, we
An
don't need to
appearance
know the
option is
details.
a specific thing. And I don't know, well, we can do options of tabular and look. I presume there is.
Yes,
but-
there is an appearance option.
I don't.
No.
Do I want to run these or not?
No.
There you go. It's the first option.
Okay, so what does it have as the right-hand side? Is it an association or what is it?
It's probably a string or less. It can probably be a number of things, strings, lists of
Okay.
strings.
For
That's
data
the
set, what did
standard
we
for
do in
appearance
appearance?
options.
Okay, so with data set, we have more elaborate options, yes?
Yes, in dataset, the options are separate. I think the idea is to have them here together, at least for the moment.
Together
I-
where?
I-
In appearance or what?
In the appearance option, yes. So I think Brett's team is working on this.
Yes, and data set
And there's
also
no
have an
representative from that
appearance
team here, is
option.
that correct?
Mhm.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I'd like to say that if we put these into data set, I don't understand why we would not be trying to move them into tabular as well.
I mean,
We have an elaborate design that we want to present soon, which may or may not make it to iteration 1 of this tabular.
Okay.
But
I
it's looking
understand,
very
but-
promising.
Okay, but is it going to be equivalent to the dataset one? What are we going to do with dataset one? What's the idea?
It's a
there?
little bit more sophisticated than the dataset one, because the dataset one, none of it looks, if you're going to look at data, you kind of have to
Okay, Roger,
do
dissing what we have in dataset is not useful. Whatever we do, we've got to make sure that
but
it
I
fits in
cannot.
with dataset.
I'm going to say what you say. Let's define where we're going, and then we figure out the bridge.
That's fine. That's
Okay.
fine. I agree with you.
Okay.
That's fine. But
Right,
but
and obviously data set theme doesn't make sense in tabular.
yeah, right.
Right.
I think we have something that you're going to appreciate. Okay.
Okay,
When
fine.
we can show
Fine.
what it can achieve.
Okay. So what are we doing? So that means we're tabling whatever Carlo is talking about for the appearance option for the time when we have these more serious options for display.
I
Right.
think so.
Okay, fine. So Carlo, make sure that we have that information from Carlo so that we know when we are discussing these other display options that we have that available.
Mhm. Okay.
Okay. All right. What's next? What are we looking at next?
I think we should really delve into pivot wider and pivot longer because we
Okay.
didn't
All right. Okay,
do
fine.
last time.
Okay. So let me see if I still remember what the heck was going on there from a few days ago.
So we spend most of the time
yeah.
looking at the previous function, pivot table, and you have your notes in those from the previous meeting sections.
Okay.
And then we started
so
looking
this is
at
pivot. This is the pivot table thing.
pivot
Okay,
table,
so
exactly.
Right.
so
I don't think we
this
need
is
to
what
go into those. I think we want to just start really diving into pivot wider. which
okay,
we
but so
actually
did we
discussed
solve
last
pivot table? Did we feel like we solved it?
Module of the name, what we decided is to separate the two. There is a list of lists there, and we spent some time discussing whether it was possible to separate them into two arguments. And moving, so the general notation, and Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, is those two lists we see there arrow a column renamer function, which would be moved into an option.
I'm sorry. Which thing? Well, what are we looking at?
Pivot table,
Yes,
that,
so
that input
compare
right
that.
there. Right now the syntax is list row keys goes to func as one argument.
I see.
No,
So
it's,
just
It's not?
it's list of row keys, comma, call keys.
Oh, sorry. That's what I meant. That's not what I actually said, but yes, that is what I meant.
okay. So can you just remind me? It's a bad sign that I've already forgotten how this works. Remind me. This is our proposed final syntax here. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So just let's walk through. Just say, as they say in your own words, so to speak. What does this do? What's the one sentence for what it does?
Okay, what it does is it doesn't aggregate rows of tab, func, join of row keys, call keys.
Okay. Aggregate rows of tab.
Tab, comma, func.
Okay.
And then
On which rows? Because aggregate rows is the third argument, right?
Right. And then it's join of row keys, comma, call keys.
By the way, bug there. Somebody make a note of that, please. Function
Got it.
template,
Mhm.
whatever it is.
It's join in a flat list.
No, that can't be right.
It is right. It's join of row keys, comma, call keys.
How can that be right? I mean, aggregate rows is, it aggregates those rows.
We have categorical columns, right? The rows and the columns, right? But when we aggregate rows, that's all flat. All the categories that we want to aggregate on is in one list. So that's why Rob says join them.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, row keys means the label of the row,
Yes.
which could be,
But those
No,
rows,
those are the maybe keys is not the right word to use. It's the columns you want to see listed as rows versus the columns you want to see listed as columns.
right. Yeah. So the name there
Keys is maybe misleading.
okay, so that isn't right. So just tell me what it is. So
call it row calls, comma, call calls.
row columns and column columns.
what the hell does that mean?
And
What does that mean?
Well,
but
join
Rob,
those.
how does it know which is, how does aggregate know which is which if you're joining them in a flat
The
list?
aggregate doesn't need to know.
I see.
Okay.
What
so that's
are those things? Are those the names of columns? They're all the names
Yes.
of columns.
They're all
right?
the
Yes.
names of columns, right? Exactly.
What's the difference between a row call and a call in this case?
Because
Well-
it's going to lay out the table with some of them being rows and some of
For
them
example,
being
in those
columns.
two examples above, okay, look at the pivot table examples and imagine they're separate arguments. Okay. So class shows up as listed by rows, right? And sec shows up listed as columns. Whereas if you reverse them, it's exactly the opposite.
Okay, so let me see if I can write a piece of text here.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say pivots. What did I just do? Pivots tab so that yeah, we're going to change this to so that the columns in the list row calls oh gosh, remind me what this is again. Okay, these become, wait a minute. Okay, just a minute. Okay, just a minute. And the columns in the list column call calls become columns in the new tabular. It isn't the columns, it's the entries and the categorical entries.
Yes, right. It's the entries in the list called. Yeah, right. Precisely.
Categorical entries in the columns in the list become columns in the new tabular. Okay, so that the columns in the list row calls. So what is it? The columns in row calls.
Because again, the entries become.
Well, they become
Okay,
key columns is one thing.
Tell me what it is again. The
entries in the columns in the list row calls become keys for rows. Or I guess if you wanted to make it more parallel, you could just say become rows in in the new tabular.
become rows in the new tabular. Okay.
Yeah.
Of course, we don't say func anywhere in this
Right.
description.
Well, you're
So what does
missing.
func do?
So
What does
what you're
func do?
missing in that sentence is it does an aggregation with the function func.
Okay. All right. Okay. Pivots up by aggregating using the function func.
Yeah.
And makes. Why does it need to do that? What does func return? Okay, func takes a list of things and returns a single thing. Is that true?
Yeah, typically
Right.
total or mean.
Okay, so let's just remind ourselves. So func takes a list of entries, of values,
Yes.
and returns a single value.
Right.
Right.
Right?
Right. So you might phrase it as pivots by aggregating values using the function func.
And puts. And okay, makes. But now, okay, and
So,
makes
yeah.
a new tabular in which entries in the columns become rows. I mean, I'm not writing quite the right words here.
Yeah.
Okay, entries in the columns in the list row calls. So this is categorical entries again.
Yeah, I think
Again,
it's
here.
which unique entries are categorical entries.
Okay, in which unique entries.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But from my understanding, is pivot table just aggregate rows plus pivot wider?
Exactly. That's all it is.
All it is.
So okay, right. So I was going to ask how does it know how does it know which are rows which are rows and which are columns? And so you're saying it's there has to be an additional operation there to distinguish.
Right. Yeah. So so Stephen's written step 1 there, and what we need step 2 is to do the pivot wider, which I think we changed the name to something like possible name change was columns to values or values to columns.
Right, exactly. So that was values to columns, and that was and the other one is columns to values. Is that right?
Right. Those are possibilities.
And I mean,
So it's values to columns of aggregate rows of blah blah blah.
Yes. Right.
But do we ever, like in the documentation, do we ever say in the usage message, this is effectively like calling this and then that, or does that only go in the...
We're not writing the usage message yet, okay? We're not writing the usage message. We're just trying to understand for our own purposes.
Sorry. It felt like a usage message.
No, we're not writing the usage message.
No.
We're trying to make sure that we could write a usage message.
Yes.
Okay. So let's just understand what values to columns does. What values to columns does is it takes of tab, comma, a column, right?
Yeah.
One column. Is that correct?
Well, it could be, group sets a set of columns too.
Okay. Cols. Okay.
You know, Stephen, if you have discrete variables, right? So having a vector of variables can be flattened into one.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Okay. So takes the unique entries. No, this isn't the right way around. Takes what is happening here? Takes the unique entries in the columns calls. Is that what it's doing? Values.
So it needs values to columns needs two sets of columns. One which are the columns that are the categorical thing. And you also need to tell it where are the values coming from that are going to go in those new columns.
Okay, which order are we putting these in? Are they new columns? There's a list of new columns here.
Right.
But are these two corresponding lists, or how does it
Well,
work?
no, the name of the new columns we don't need. It's the columns. So look at the aggregate rows above, and I'll try and explain what's happening. Okay, no, don't go. Kind of keep the screen where you were. Yeah, that one. Okay, so what we're doing to make that pivot table is we're taking sex. It has two categories, female and male.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But we also, what we need to tell it what, because this table may have 100 different columns, right? So we need to tell it which values you want to associate to those new columns. And that comes from, so you need to specify the column that's going to become the names, the categorical column, but you also need to specify the value column.
Survival percent in this case.
Right.
Okay, that's the so previously the rows here were individual people, right?
Yes.
But in this case, the rows, so we want to say here, and by the way, Carla, please make sure you know where we're writing all of these different um what am I saying? All these different notes of proto whatever they are. Okay, proto usage message. Okay, so aggregates rows in tab. Well, let's see what we're going to write this here. Carla, you are keeping track of where we're writing these things, right? So we're going to collect them together. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So now what's the name of that second entry? That's this new column, right? New col arrow func.
Right.
And these are old cols, right? Or cols or something, right? Aggregates rows in tab by taking unique well, let's say it creates rows in tab from the unique values in cols, from the combinations of unique values in cols, aggregating using as the values of these rows. Okay, wait a minute. Creating rows in tab from combinations. Okay, it's going to, wait a minute. Okay, hold on. Creates a new tabular with columns or something, new col. Can there be multiple ones there? There can, right? There can be new col 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Creates a new tabular with column new col columns, new calls, or whatever. And rows obtained from
This you have new calls and plus calls, I think, not just new calls.
No. That's not right. Hold on 1 second. Okay, hold on. With okay, you're right. Okay, good. Creates a new tabular with columns, calls, and new calls, where no. Look, okay. Calls contains the unique values from where each new call I contains only the unique values from the old call I. And where new columns have been created, new columns, new call I, have been created using the aggregation function func. What do you think of this?
Funki.
I think it's really close, but what is the aggregation funci applied to?
Hash everything, hash anything.
No, see, it's only so for each value and call I that's unique, the function is applied to all rows with that same value of that same unique value.
I see. Using the function aggregation functions funci applied to the lists of values associated with the unique That is the longest and most complicated usage methods in the system.
I think it would be one thing you could improve instead of list of values. I think you could put the rows of tab.
It's not the rows of tab, it's the columns. It's applied to column.
Well, that's yeah.
Okay, hold on. Let's see if we can make this okay. Creates a new tabular in which rows have been aggregated. Just a minute. Thinking of something like this. Wait a minute. Creates a new tabular in which rows have been aggregated. By grouping together entries with the same values for in the col I. Combining entries that have the same values. Okay. The new tabular has rows whose keys are the unique entries from the col I. It has, in addition to the columns col I, it has new columns, new col I, formed by the lists of values, aggregating lists of values I think that's roughly right.
The problem is the func I gets an association, not a list.
Okay, all right. What is an association of?
It's association of the subcolumns.
Okay, all right. By aggregating values using the func I, the values in association each column in the original tabular, the func I, well, here, I think there'll be more of a note below. The func I are applied to an association whose values are fungi are applied for each of the new rows. The fungi are applied to an association to generate the values for each of the new rows. The fungi are applied to an association whose keys are the columns, are the keys for the columns in tab, and whose values, entries, whatever, are lists of the values in each column associated with the unique entries in col I of lists of values that are being aggregated for this row. Does that make sense? You guys are really
Yeah, I think it works.
driving my technical writing skills here.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now you want me to, let's do pivot table. Actually, we got all these to do. Okay. All right.
So notice on
What?
the, sorry,
No, I'm thinking about the name pivot table. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was going to mention that in the examples before, we have the three outputs, which represent the two steps that we are discussing here. So there is a Titanic notebook at the beginning, the aggregates rows, which you just described, and then the other steps to the pivot table.
Okay. What does pivot table mean? Is that word, is the table the output supposed to designate the output, or is pivot table supposed to designate the action of pivoting?
I think it's kind of both, but it's literally presented as a table.
Yeah.
Maybe we should be calling it pivot. Or we should call it pivot tabular.
The only the only challenge is it's not a sort of a clean tabular. Do you know what I'm saying? Where each column is a variable, and each row is a measurement.
What do you mean?
I mean,
Yeah.
so when we want to do processing, generally processing, we want sort of a clean tabular where each column represents effectively a variable, and each row represents a measurement across many variables.
Yes.
This one is not quite, it's not that. The output from pivot table is not that. So it's unclean in that sense. But it's perfect for humans. It's not perfect for processing.
Is that distinguishing it from pivot wider and pivot, whatever the opposite of pivot wider is?
Longer, yeah. So those two operations, you could.
Okay. All right.
I think pivot wider has the same problem. Pivot longer doesn't.
Okay, so let's just write what this might say. Generates a pivot table version of the tabular tab. Okay. In which unique entries. By the way, are call calls and row calls the right way around, right argument order?
I think so. You usually think row columns, right?
Okay,
So
right, okay. Generates a pivot table version of the tabular tab. Whose rows are defined by the unique values, the unique entries in the columns row calls, and whose
Oh, and I think
what?
the point of pivot table is that row calls and call calls are all unique values you take. The difference is with aggregate rows is that ones you put on top and ones you put on the bottom, but the content it's like aggregating together on row calls and call calls together, and then
Okay,
rearranging.
this is not the point. Point is, if you're going to explain this to anybody and have them have any chance of understanding what's going on, you have to say what the point is.
Yeah, but I think
And
the
so
point,
describing the mechanics of how it works is not what you do in the first sentence.
no, but what I'm saying is that the mechanic of how it works is that it's a double entry table. So it's so and you put at the intersection of rows and columns the aggregations of that row and that column together. So
And
it's
I was going to say, I think your sentence below, the one you're working on now, actually is a reasonably good description of what it does.
I don't like it.
Okay.
I'm lost halfway through the sentence. I want to say what the point is first. You see what I'm saying? The first thing is to say what the point is, then to say how it works.
Mhm.
Then it's a pivot table version. It's like, what am I trying to do here? Pivot table version, whose rows are defined by the unique entries in the columns row calls, and whose columns are they literally the columns call calls?
No, they're the values of
They're
call calls.
they're the values.
no, they're not even the values. Like they're the values become the labels.
Right. The unique values become the labels.
And
Unique
the same
values of
goes
what?
for the rows.
Wait, the unique values of what?
Unique values of call calls become the labels of the columns in the output.
There is one call and there's one row call. The unique values of row call become the keys to the rows, and the unique values of the call calls become the keys of the columns. The space between those is filled in with the output of func. So it's important that the row calls and the call calls go only in the keys, in the headers.
So if there's only one of each, why is it row calls and not row call and call and call?
Because I guess with like some tricks of standard keys and so on, you can do some terrible stuff with it, and then have.
Can we zoom out for a
column.
minute, please? Just explain to me. Okay, the unique entries. I see. Whose rows are defined by the unique entries in the columns row calls, and whose columns are defined by the unique entries in the columns call calls.
But if you write
Yes?
it like you're using
Mhm.
column in one part of the sentence, column means the content of the column, and in the other, it means the keys of the column. So when you say whose columns and whose rows, you mean whose column keys and whose row
Yeah.
keys are defined by the
Okay,
entries.
wait a second. Wait a minute.
Whose row labels?
Labels maybe yet something different. I hate it because it's really who's with rows generates a pivot table version of the tabular tab with rows defined by the unique
I mean, I think that works. I'm not sure what the objection to that is.
With rows defined by the unique entries in the columns row calls, and with columns defined by the unique. Okay. Okay, this is vaguely understandable. Okay. The values in the pivot table version are generated by aggregating. I see we have a sentence from Seth Chandler here in our live stream. Let me pull in Seth's drafting to use his domain's language. I think by the time we've got row columns like that, it's a bit, we're a little bit rows.
Stephen, I sent you a notebook called Explaining Pivot X.
But Seth's description is actually quite, I mean, it really goes to the purpose of it, which is nice.
Yes, it's important that we explain the purpose. Although usually in usage messages, we don't so much explain the purpose, although maybe that's a mistake. Seth is doing a better job at the marketing of the point of this function, which is an important thing, rather than what we tend to do in usage messages, which is just say what it does, so to speak. This is highly useful. Thank you. Okay, let's just look at Roger's pivotology.
Yeah.
What I want to know is, how do pivot tables show up in quantum mechanics? What are they? I bet there's something.
Bet there is.
Yeah, I bet there's something in some projection.
I mean,
operator.
it is always some form of aggregation that's going on here, and measurement is probably aggregation in quantum mechanics. So,
well, it's more. This is some kind of projection operator applied to something. Just so for my understanding, what is the relation, if any, between relational algebra and all of this?
Actually, the beginning of this notebook that I cut this out of was all about relational algebra for that very reason.
But there is a very clean mapping. There is this notebook that I've shown you a couple of times called labeled array, that basically translates from operations you would do on a pivoted data set to operations you do on a relational data set. But I was thinking something else. Could we say it in terms like pivot table constructs a table where the value corresponding to row I call I is constructed from func on the subtabular that has value blah for and blah for. So like we define it as the sparse array. The value at position blah is given by.
Okay, look, we got to start here. I think it's important. Honestly, I really like the idea of saying generates a pivot table version of, saying this. Because something like this. Like I've got some mental image of what the heck I'm doing here. And how you rearrange these things, how you actually aggregate them. Like I can imagine the thing I'm imagining. Okay, so I'm trying to do something and I'm trying to say I want to see all the data about this and all the data about that. Secondary question, how do I combine this data? So I'm saying I think in the conceptually you think first, what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to see from the data? And the second question is, do I do a mean? Do I do a median? Whatever else. That's why I think we should lead with this. This is what we're trying to achieve. Maybe that's wrong, but maybe another way of looking at it, the first thing you're doing is saying I'm doing an aggregation. But okay, we sort of have a vague understanding here. We haven't completely nailed it, but that we've got some pieces here. Now let's talk about values to columns, columns to values. Okay. What that's really saying is take the unique entries Okay, this is Carlo's version. That's not bad, Carlo. That's not bad. That's a nice structural explanation. The subtabular defined that contains that's not bad. Okay, we're getting there. All right, let's go to I like that. I pretty much like that. Okay, let's go to this. So first of all, tell me again what it does. Can somebody tell me what it does, please?
So values to columns is basically the same as pivot table without the aggregation first. So
Yeah.
you have no guarantee that the entries are unique. So it's what's left to take you from the aggregate row thing to the to the pivot table version.
Tell me what do you think it should say here?
Well, let's put in a full specification before we try and describe it. Okay, so you need a column for the column names, and you need a column for the actual values that go
Okay,
in.
so how many arguments does values to columns have?
I think it could have I think it should be calls, it should be a pair of things. It should be a list of, ideally it would be a list of rules or something like that.
Okay.
But
okay, so values to columns. Okay, so then just say, so this is val call to call, val call to call 1. Is that right? Val call to call 2. Is that right?
yes, I think that should be adequate.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So now we say, rearranges tab so that I don't understand this now. I don't understand. So that the unique values in valcol 1 become what in col 1?
Well, I think with that notation, I would have expected col 1 to be the column that you get the names of the new columns from. But maybe you're thinking about it the other
Okay,
direction.
well, I don't
around.
know. I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know. Rearrange this tab so that the unique, well, the names of the new columns.
You don't have to
Yeah.
give names because those come from the unique values.
Well, so what the heck is col 1 doing?
Col 1 is, okay, so if you're thinking about the values of the column, the val call has to be the ones with unique names. And then the values that go in those new columns with those unique names has to come from col 1.
Sorry, say that again.
Shouldn't you then say val col and name col?
Yeah, but if we're calling it values to columns, that's
Well, let's not worry what we're calling
right.
it yet. Okay.
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah.
Okay, so now tell me what it should say here.
Okay, so it rearranges tab with so that there are new columns with unique values in name col 1.
Rearranges tab to so it doesn't affect the rows. Is this true?
Yes, it affects the rows. That's why it's called wider. It's typically putting fewer rows and more columns.
Maybe it's like
Mm-hmm.
okay. Rearranges tab so that its entries in rows so that so that certain, oh gosh, what is it doing again? Let me see an example. Where is it?
Yeah, so look at the aggregate and then the pivot table example.
No, I don't want to see that.
No.
I want to see pivot
Okay.
wider.
Pivot wider, yes.
Oh, that we have below some, or that, yeah.
No, this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, where's the original?
Above.
Yeah.
That's above.
So your name column is extreme. It has two unique values, high, low.
Yes.
That become column names. They pivot to become column names.
Right. Okay, let me remind myself what this is saying. Yeah. Oh, for God's sake. So I'm just going to try pivot to columns and pivot to rows.
Mm-hmm.
Rearranges tab so that unique values, unique entries in col, whatever it is, to a column for each unique entry in each unique value in just to create a new column for each unique value in the original column col, let's say. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, where do the entries in those new columns come from?
I see. Create a new column for each unique value in the original, taking that, taking the entries in the new columns from the whatever the names are.
We might, maybe it makes sense to call it e-call for entry columns. So
Oh, no,
val
hold on a
call.
second. So let's, what do we have to specify here?
So we have to specify the column the names are coming from and the
Okay.
columns the entries are coming from.
I would guess that it's like name first and val after.
Yeah, I think that's,
Val col. Okay.
but I think if we
From-
do it by rules, then we can have several sets of them.
I know. From the, okay. Well, we in the documentation we can give the one with the single
Yeah.
one first. To create a new column for each unique value in the column new call, column name call. With the entries in the new column coming from the column val col.
The thing that this doesn't explain is what happens to, like, if you read this, you wouldn't think that this changes the number of rows, but it does.
Well, the entries in the new column come from the
Aggregating.
No, there's no
No,
aggregation.
there's no
in this case.
aggregation.
It's the entries in the column valco from the rows in the column valco call for that unique value.
The entries in the new column
What?
coming
No,
from
wait. The number of rows is determined by all the columns that you haven't mentioned anywhere. The day call there, for example, is not mentioned in the spec. And so basically what you're saying is that I don't even know how it works when they're not key columns, but basically the number of rows is defined by the set of columns that you haven't mentioned anywhere.
Yes, that's correct.
I am honestly, I kind of understand pivot table, but just because you can only do it with things that are already unique. What this does, pivot wider, when there's no guarantee of uniqueness, is baffling to me.
Okay.
Yep.
You know what pivot wider reminds me of is in typesetting, mathematical typesetting before modern times when authors typeset themselves. There were all these names that the people in the typesetting business used for mathematical notation. So, for example, I believe fences were the name for the things which were like modulus vertical bars. What's my point here? My point is there is a kind of semantic, non-semantic word, and that's if you are a person who's got a bunch of lead type and you're trying to find the thing that, corresponds to this mathematical notation, you don't really care what the notation stands for. You just want to know, I want the thing that looks like that. And I feel like pivot wider is a name that is sort of reminiscent of, I just want the thing to be that shape. And I don't know whether people, I feel like, what is the conceptual seed that people have that leads them to this operation?
Well, you're right. Like, I think you nailed something on the head there, that pivot wider is something that it's like a total dead end for processing. Pivot wider is something that you only care about for presentation, for typesetting. So, and
I don't know if it's true. I don't know if that's true. I don't
that's
think
not always
true.
true, but it's often true.
Okay, but I want to know, what is the seed? What is the conceptual seed? If the conceptual seed is, I just want it to be, this shape, right? If that's what people, it's like an aspect ratio type thing. If that's what people are thinking, that's one thing. I'm skeptical
That's
of
not
that.
the case. The example that's in the reference page shows kind of why you might want it. It's like how people collect data is not in a way that you want to process data necessarily.
Right.
So it's
Okay,
type of structural
fine.
cleaning operation.
Okay.
The example there in this notebook produces a tabular, which is perfectly fine. I mean, we could use it as a starting tabular in any other place. It's just data in a different
right.
structure.
Yeah, but it's clunky.
Okay.
Because
Okay, doesn't matter. Yeah. Look, hold on. What we're trying to figure out is, okay, is the notion, pivot table, pivot to columns. I don't know whether pivot to columns is the right thing. It's like, we've got aggregate rows. I keep on saying it wrong, which is not a good sign.
I think pivot to columns is nice, actually. It does sort of, because you're creating new columns by pivoting.
It could be pivot to columns and pivot from columns.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's
not bad.
Okay, but does that fit in with pivot table? What is pivot table in this way of talking about it?
Well, you pivot to both columns and rows in that case.
But it also has aggregation in it.
No, I think you always pivot to column in pivot table.
It's a combination of aggregation and pivot to columns. Yeah.
You don't pivot to rows.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, if you pivot from columns on a pivot table, you get aggregate rows.
So, I mean, obviously, we could call it aggregated pivot to columns. I mean, that's kind of a stupid name, but it is descriptive.
Yeah.
Well, another way to do it, this is a bit. So if you look at the pivot table, we have pivot table, tab, func, row calls, call calls. If call calls is the null list, i.e. there are none, that is aggregate rows.
Sorry, which one?
If call calls is the empty list,
in which case? In pivot table.
In
pivot table, the result is the same as aggregate rows of tab, func. We have to give the func a name, but row calls.
What I don't like is the motion of pivot to columns, pivot from columns, which is fine, and then pivot table, which is not a motion word.
But Steven, pivot. I think that while pivot longer, pivot wider, etc., like you go to different things and they have different names in different.
Yeah. What are you saying? get
pivot
to it.
table has been the same name since Lotus 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, I know.
Applied
I
it in
know.
high
I'm well
school,
aware of this. I know.
maybe middle school.
Okay, so what's your point?
My point is that you should call it that because people know it by that name. And
I am aware of this point. I think it would be enough to have the word pivot in there. It's not obvious it has to be pivot and that single thing. I understand the argument.
Pivot table is a noun. It's a visual tabular.
Yeah. And I don't think there's such a distinction. I mean, there's things like column-wise pivot, but I don't think that's very nice. Pivot to columns. Pivot to columns is fairly descriptive. It makes columns from what would otherwise be just entries.
Yes.
Well, provisionally, I think this makes sense. Okay, what do we have to figure out? I'm somewhat pivoted out here. Have we thought through what the minimal example is? And let me make a suggestion for documentation, okay? That we do something where we have, for goodness sake, don't have real data, have ABC, 1, 2, 3, those kinds of things in the kind of pictorial examples.
Sure.
Do you see what I'm saying? And that way, and keep it really, really minimal. Try to see what is the minimal case that isn't ambiguous. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And I think having that illustration there will be helpful.
by the way, remember when we had a bunch of Flash, I mean, it was before I joined the company, Flash animations that explain.
I'm aware of those, yeah.
Function. This is the kind of thing that makes way more sense if you make it like an animation rather than a static picture.
Good luck.
No.
I think it will be incomprehensible. Yeah. I think it's one of those things that the thing about animations and exposition, you know, a zillion times I've thought, gosh, golly, I should use an animation for this. The problem with an animation is you are not in control of how quickly you digest it. You see what I'm saying? If it's a visual thing with a series of steps, you can look at one step, look at the next step. Oh, I didn't understand what was happening. Look back at the previous step, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas in animation, you are being force-fed the thing at a certain rate. And very often, what's that?
If it's something that loops and it's 2 seconds
doesn't
long.
help, does not help. People don't manage to. The only way that animations are helpful is where there is some kind of overall effect that you're seeing. I mean, I find it in, you know, in those animations that we had looked really cool, but most people were like, that's cool. And they were like, what did it do again? I mean, it may be useful giving some intuitive sense. I think it is useful for that, for something like partitioning a list or something. It is useful for giving a visual sense, but it is not useful for saying in detail what it does. And maybe in this case, I mean, I kind of think that particularly if we do this and we have like color backgrounds for these different entries and things, that it will be fairly obvious we have before and after. See what I'm saying? I'm optimistic about that. All right. Anything else that we have to cover in this meeting? Give me a bit of a roadmap. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say one thing that is funny about this function is that pivot from columns is unimplementable lazily for lazy backends. Pivot to columns is. There's this weird asymmetry because one is denormalizing and the other is normalizing. One is data dependent, the other isn't. They're really not the same.
Okay, so what?
Just saying.
How can either of them not be data dependent?
Because so the from columns, you take in values and put them in columns. So you have to actually look at the data to know what the outgoing columns are. And so if you do it when you do
No,
an
I'm sorry,
lazy-
two columns as well needs to know what the unique entries are,
Yeah.
right?
no, two columns doesn't. It needs to know what the name of the columns are.
No, what the name of the destination columns is, which come from the unique entries
Sorry,
in the data.
from
which means-
column. From columns doesn't need to look at the data.
That's right.
Because the
Pivot
data
from
is in
columns.
the. So the point is that two columns.
Oh, wait. You're saying from columns. That's correct. It is a merely structural rearrangement.
Yes.
Right.
Okay. Likewise, if you said from the outside, two columns, you already know what the unique entries are and so on. I don't know whether, well, it needs to know where those are. It needs to do a position basically to find out where those are.
Yeah.
Whereas the other one is just indexing with part.
Yes, pretty much.
Right. So yes, I agree.
But I mean, there is a version that would be implementable of pivot two columns.
Why does this matter? Does this matter? Go ahead.
Yes, but it matters for the design because if pivot, two columns, if we had something that for this example is set to automatic, but where you could specify that, for example, the things are Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
Yeah.
No, then I could implement it.
I understand.
You
That's what I
know
was
beforehand
basically
what the
saying
columns
before.
have to be.
You need to
Yeah.
know what's in the columns, right?
Yeah.
I think we should hide that detail. I think.
Okay.
I think that you can. There may very well be, in the end, some kind of, database machinery options that you have to give. I can quite imagine that. Various
I
kinds of
don't.
optimizations and so on.
Yeah, but I don't think it's very interesting in general because it's something that you do to visualize the data in a nicer way.
No,
And if
I understand, but I'm just saying in terms of design, right?
Yeah.
I think we might want to give ourselves an escape valve for communicating with the database server. In a bunch of these cases, this would be one of the things you might choose to communicate with the database server. That's all I'm saying.
I thought so far this is the first time I've come up and I've already implemented a lot of these things that we've designed for the databases. So hopefully not too much.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Good.
Actually, our original design for the pivot wider with that extreme temp, that automatic, I mean, it could be the new column names. That's actually
Fine.
how I originally had done it.
Yeah. All right, you've got some more detail to fill in here. I am really, my gosh, seriously pivoted out. I hope I'm going to, maybe this will become. I always find when people talk about, oh, I use Excel, and have you learned how to use pivot tables yet? And most people say no. And then some people who feel very sophisticated say, I know pivot tables. So maybe I'm now in the class that can say, I know pivot tables.
A little historical note I just looked up. So pivot tables were first implemented in Lotus Improv on the Next at Steve Jobs' behest, although they were called flexible views. It wasn't until that idea was copied into Excel that they were named pivot tables.
Ah, that makes sense. Huh. Huh. Well, good for Steve. I wonder if Teo or I was around when that whole discussion was happening. That's interesting. I wonder what led him to. I mean, I'm sure he said, I need to summarize this data in a better way.
Right. It seems like Lotus was experimenting with this, and when he saw sort of an early prototype, was like, this is the thing you need to do. Or write this for the next, and we'll take over the world in his typical fashion.
Yes.
But I also think it's interesting that he named it a view. So he considered it like a visual thing.
Yes.
Yep.
Makes me wonder whether we should call it pivot view.
The table.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I mean,
I
there
think
is a
that's a
part
little
of me.
dangerous, just because view sounds an awful lot like a user interface element.
Yeah, I kind of agree with
Yeah,
you.
but on the other hand, I've thought about like, what if pivot from columns was like a pivot form? Like maybe not but it's like just a way of re-representing the same data without changing the data. Sorry, pivot two columns, not from.
Let me think about this for a second.
I mean, we list it partly as a data cleaning operation. It's a structural cleaning operation.
It's partly that, and it's partly viewing.
Yes.
But that's kind of the idea behind labeled array, that can be, you can have a tabular underneath, but it behaves like a deeply nested matrix tensor kind of thing.
I still disagree strongly with this point of view. Once you have a tabular output, it doesn't matter where it came from. If it's still usable, it's a tabular in itself.
Yeah, but if you look at that pivot the second example on the notebook on the right,
Yes.
if you decide that you want to have like the difference between high and low, I mean, there are difference between high and low per each day is something that is easy to compute. But then the things that you want to compute vertically becomes almost impossible. Like you are introducing a strong anisotropy that makes it harder to work with the data.
To do things that you wanted to do with the
Yeah.
previous tabular, but now you
It
do
depends what you want to do. I mean, you might want to do something different here. I need to go, but this is an interesting example. This flexible views thing is an interesting example of what I found all over the place, which is it's always useful to know where ideas come from. It illuminates the ideas. I think it'll be interesting to know a little bit more of that story, because I think we might learn something. I wonder if there's probably, Lotus Improv. It'd be interesting to see if we can find the documentation that they had for these things, because they had to explain it for the first time. So anyway, should go. All right, we're making progress. See you all soon.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.